Welcome back, tributes to episode 91 of Into the Arena. I'm Holly.
I'm Emily.
And I just can't believe we're at 91 episodes. I think we're talking about that number just going up, and it just scares me because the last time we did an episode similar to this was episode 5, which is ridiculous. So we have come a long way. So the last time we did a Suzanne Collins interview episode, that was episode 5. That was the 10-year anniversary of the Hunger Games. And now we have the Barnes & Noble exclusive edition interview with David Levithan and Suzanne Collins. So we're going to be talking about that, but otherwise, I guess let's just dive into this crazy episode of our Sunrise on the Reaping interview with Suzanne Collins.
Yeah, I feel we were just talking and you said that you only just read this interview, whereas I read it as soon as I could, right after I finished the book. Maybe I waited a few hours just to decompress a little, but you've kind of been holding on to not reading this interview.
I've been holding on mostly because I don't want the book to be done. So that was me just like kind of holding on to that. It's been a couple months. I think it's time. But also, I wanted to make my own connections and form different theories and ideas with fans. I know she says a lot in these interviews, and I really kind of wanted to just take my time with it, and I guess this sort of forced me to read it. So I've read it, I'm up to date. I am all ready to talk about it because we had the 10th anniversary interview, which was very similar to this because David Levithan interviewed Suzanne Collins. But at the time, we had no knowledge of Ballad, we had no knowledge of Sunrise, and now we have 2 new books that are mentioned in this interview, which I think is just so insane.
Yeah, that's a good point that this is an interview including Ballad, and there was an interview post Ballad, I think,
Mhm.
with David too. But it's crazy that we have this interview after 2 additional books. I feel like that was such a fun episode too, and that really kicked off or at least my interest in Plutarch, which is just so funny. It's so full circle that now we have this book and Plutarch is a major character in it. I feel like the first question is honestly a really good place to start, and I'm glad that David asked this question first. Did you always know that you'd write a novel about the Second Quarter Quell? Because I feel like that's a question that everybody was asking before this book came out, and probably after the fact too. Of course, I feel like she answers it in the way that we would expect because she said a similar thing post Ballad, that she comes up with the idea first and then decides where do I want to set, those themes, and that it just worked well. The fact that she wanted to write about implicit submission, inductive reasoning, propaganda, and love, and that just fit with Haymitch's story, which is a story that she says she did always want to tell but didn't know if she would get to it.
And I think the fact that she got to write about love and propaganda and so many themes that are very relevant to like Haymitch's story. I think this book was like the most exciting material for me just because the propaganda aspect of it and the fact that like she knew what had happened because she had drafted this in her head, but she already had this misleading situation of what happened in the game. So she kind of talks a little bit about how she had to navigate what she already wrote versus what she could add. She could have chosen to write about anyone. And I mean, like, obviously, we're getting for a Plutarch story, but I definitely think it was interesting how she started with those initial themes and then branched out and picked a character to go with it.
I also like the idea that she didn't just list, she has the implicit submission, inductive reasoning, propaganda, but love is like something that she, from the outset, wanted to write about, and that kind of goes with these themes in her mind, and then decided, okay, and that fits with Haymitch's story. Because
Yeah.
I feel like I've said on an episode before that what does it take to defy implicit submission? And I feel like several scenes that we've seen in the trilogy and also in Haymitch's story, love is the answer. Like characters sticking up for Gale, like at the whipping post, and Katniss volunteering for her sister, and Haymitch intervening with the peacekeepers at the reaping. Like the answer is love can be what it takes when you care about someone so much that you're not going to go along with the implicit submission.
I love that she includes love because there's so many forms of love in the Hunger Games universe. And I mean, we have Katniss and Prim, we have that sibling love, but we also have Lenore Dove and Haymitch, which is that real and like romantic love.
Hmm.
And I just thought that this book is so great because it explores so many different versions of love, like the other Hunger Games books do. When you think of the Hunger Games, you don't think of love. And so I'm really
Right. Like
happy
you
that
might
that was
think
like,
of Katniss and Peeta,
mhm.
but like there's so much love. And I feel like in Sunrise, there was so much love and like care between characters that kind of balance out all of the horrible things that were
Mhm.
happening.
Too. We talk about implicit submission, and David Hume talking about,
Quote, the easiness with which the many are governed by the few.
she talks about how she says we're allowing ourselves to be controlled by opinion.
Yeah, and I think my takeaway from her answer there is like what we're doing right now, right? And the discourse that's happening online is the goal that she had for the book. And her goal is pretty simple for writing the series, I think, is that she wants people to be thinking about these things and discussing, and hopefully, ripples will be created from her creation.
No more snow edits, okay? No
No, I
more
love
snow
them.
edits.
Oh, I would look so bad if you went through my collections on TikTok.
Me too. I think we all would.
I love Tom. I love him.
But then she kind of, I think it's interesting, David and Suzanne kind of switch. And the next question talks a little bit more about Katniss and Haymitch and Coriolanus and how all these characters start in very different ways. So Haymitch is obviously has a lot more to lose because he has a giving family and he has Lenore Dove and he has a future that looks kind of promising in the world that he's living in. His emotional loss is definitely going to be the greatest loss, and that differentiates him from Corio and Katniss in ways that we haven't explored before, which is something that she notes.
I kind of disagree with this a little bit. I feel like, yes, she has a bit of a harder life because she's the provider, but I think she's pretty content with her life. She has to protect Prim, like keep her alive and her mother alive, but she has a best friend that she goes to the woods with. She has Gale. She loves her sister. I feel like she's not that much different from Haymitch at the beginning, other than the fact that she has to be the provider, and Haymitch is a little bit more carefree. But I don't really think that she has less to lose or is less happy, I guess.
Yeah, it's almost like they view Haymitch and Katniss view the world in different ways. Katniss is definitely more realistic. Like she doesn't want to have kids. She doesn't envision this future where it's like a perfect life for herself. I think Haymitch is more optimistic because his life is a little bit brighter.
Yeah,
And
he's a
so,
little more naive, but
yeah.
also they've both lost their fathers in the mines. Like, I don't know, I think it's more of a personality difference, even though I think Katniss has to go through a little bit more. But yeah,
I see where
it's
you're coming from,
interesting.
yeah.
But I mean, it is horrible that he ends up losing everything, and
Mhm.
Katniss loses a lot also, and in different ways, but still has something by the end of the book.
And then we kind of talked about this. David asks, what was it like creating a new work that you'd already loosely outlined in Catching Fire? And it's just her discussing how she already had the foundations of like Maisley, she had his arc, she had like everything general down, but now she had to step aside, like use post-it notes and write down what she knew and then grow from there.
She thought it was basically helpful, which maybe it allowed her to focus more on like the message, parts of it than figuring out plot points. David asks her a little bit about propaganda, and I thought this was a really interesting quote from him, that Haymitch watches the recap of the games and realizes how history is truly written by the victor, and are truly written by the victors and not the victor of the games. To me, this felt like the biggest revelation to Haymitch.
I think that was probably the hardest part of this book. I mean, besides all the death and awful things that happen, but the hardest part for me was watching Haymitch watch his games back and realize how different this narrative was compared to like what actually happened in his eyes and from his perspective. I think that that takes the most away from his character. That's like the most loss because he's dealing with it on his own. And this is something that he has to struggle with internally. And there's no one to turn to help him through this situation. He just has to go along with the way that he's being portrayed, which is really sickening.
Yeah, I love this quote from Suzanne. She says, All of his allies who lived the truth are dead. Keeping the real version straight in his own head while promoting the fabricated version would require constant vigilance. But deep down, or even through his white liquor fog, he realizes it's imperative that he do that. If he can't distinguish between the two, the capital wins. Like, Suzanne is giving us some really good insight here to Haymitch's life post the games between where the book ends and Katniss appears. Really, he's been the one going through this, like, real or not real concepts, like you said, on his own since his games. Like, this is devastating. She just drops this in a question answer.
I hate her. I hate her. Because she talks about how it literally just foreshadows Peeta's real or not real. And like you said, like we both are saying, it's just an internal battle that he's fighting. And like, can you imagine how devastating that would be? Years and decades of this torment. Like, Haymitch, who struggled more? Haymitch, like,
Yeah.
Haymitch goes through it.
And the fact, too, that, I mean, I think this comes up later in another question, but he doesn't tell the truth to anyone until, like, we get to the epilogue. But Katniss brings up his games and, you know, like, with what happened to Finnick, oh, is that what happened to you? And he doesn't explain further other than, yeah, I had the stunt with the force field. Question 6. David asked if you could change anything from Catching Fire, would you have done anything differently? And I think it's interesting that she notes that she wouldn't have accepted Mockingjay when we have that quote where Haymitch says that his family and his girl were killed 2 weeks after he was crowned victor. She would have changed that. And so thinking that in Sunrise, that period where he's stuck in the room and like the bunny dies and like all of that, like that didn't necessarily really need to be in the book. And she potentially would have cut that out if it didn't explicitly say 2 weeks.
I'm kind of happy that she kept it in there and had that already placed because for me it so much mirrors what Katniss goes through at the end of Mockingjay, where she's stuck in the Capitol waiting for her trial or whatever to happen.
Yeah.
And I just, as much as it felt kind of redundant a little bit, and like it could have been cut out, I definitely thought, like, I appreciated that parallel between Katniss and Haymitch and that waiting that they had to go through before
Yeah,
such
I agree. Like
awfulness.
it's nerve-wracking him waiting, and you know, it's just part of the torture, I think. And I love how she kind of just gushes too. David asks if there were any characters that she particularly enjoyed revisiting in Sunrise, and she's like, all of them.
All of them. But I think something to note here first, because this interview, I think, is an Easter egg for the fact that we're going to get another book.
Oh, okay.
Plutarch is mentioned first. And that's just something to know. Just a tiny thing that will play importance later.
I think even going back to our episode where we talk about the 10th anniversary interview, she just loves Plutarch and sees a lot of herself in Plutarch, I would say, being kind of this like mastermind behind everything. So I think she just has a very specific love for Plutarch.
She loves him. And I think it's also really exciting because she said everybody has their own story. So I'm just like, can we hear it? Like, can we talk about like
No,
what those
I
stories are?
love that she says like BD losing Amper, Effie clinging to her capital beliefs, Astrid healing the sick, Plutarch staying in the game. I feel like these motivations are things that she has known about this whole time. Rather than like specific scenes or anything like that, but I think she's really thought about what drives all of these characters and what events have happened in their life in the past to make them who they are. But now she actually gets to tell the story and, you know, create those scenes themselves. But I love that she gets to like realize her own ideas, like headcanons about her characters.
So fun. Like, imagine just writing a universe that you're so in love with, but fans are so in love with as well. And you just have this plethora of knowledge that you can just go back to and share and like kind of gatekeep. I think she's so cool.
This is one of my favorite parts of the interview, I would say, because I didn't really think about it while I was reading, but when she explained it here, it made so much sense. But the contrast between Drusilla and Effie and how there's like a generational difference between the way that they treat the tributes. She says Drusilla has lived through the cruelties of the Dark Days and has channeled her experience into vengeance against the districts. She's dehumanized them. And Effie, who was born decades after the war, has embraced the Hunger Games as her patriotic duty. It's a necessary evil and a reminder of a war that Panem can never afford to repeat. I just really liked that because I know this isn't exactly the same, but it made me think about current events and like my perspective on them versus maybe younger generations and just seeing that difference and seeing the truth of this. Like I immediately thought about like 9/11 and how I was younger and like remember that event, remember seeing it on TV and like I have such an emotional reaction to that. Whereas being online now and seeing, people sometimes make jokes about it or refer to it just as history and just how ideas about these events change over the years, I thought was just a really cool thing to include.
We get to talk about Maisie, which is so exciting because she was mentioned in Catching Fire. David says she's not so much defined by her privilege as she is by her lack of control of her life. So he kind of asks like what her main existence or like main source of living is, and she's just a rage-filled character. And Suzanne says she's one of the angriest characters I've ever written.
I feel like she's looking at it from a writing standpoint that like she's thinking about motivations all the time. When I'm writing this scene, like Maisel is angry and so she lashes out. Like she projects that anger into her actions. Whereas I don't know that other characters always do. They still like kind of hold themselves back in a way. I feel like probably the next character that I see as most angry would be Sejanus, which is interesting because I feel like he's kind of in a similar spot where he's angry about how he doesn't have control over his life either and doesn't want to be in the capital and his parents, chose all of this, but he's kind of a more privileged character as well.
But I also just one last thing in this is that just the line like Maisie remembers who the enemy is. And I
Mm-hmm.
love that she's sprinkling these pieces like real or not real, remember who the enemy is into this interview because it's connecting the original trilogy to Sunrise, which I love.
I do kind of wish that based on this answer, Maisily got to be involved in the fight against the Capitol a little bit more. Wish she was
Mhm.
looped in with the plot with Haymitch. I feel like maybe there was a little bit of missed opportunity there, but I do see how she has that kind of character growth arc that Suzanne is talking about.
But then they switch gears and they talk about Snow making an appearance. And I think it's funny she talks about comparing herself to Snow because they're the same age when she writes.
Yeah, kind of that midlife point where you're thinking about everything that has been, what's going to happen in the future. Do I have enough time in the future? Kind of being exhausted by your work and like what you've chosen as like your tent pole.
The Heavensby Library comes up multiple times throughout this interview, and I really like that it's a main point of conflict for President Snow because he holds so much hatred towards Plutarch and the Heavensby family because that was a resource that he never had. The Heavensby having like the largest library and then the Covey having like a good source of knowledge with books in their library. But I think it's important to note that books and knowledge played an important role in Snow's upcoming and the reasons why he's like so angry with the Heavensby family is because knowledge is so powerful, books are so powerful, and while one family was using them and had like a library where they don't even read half the books, other families were burning their books for fire.
I feel like it also just really highlights the role of education and knowledge and how important that is because the character who had the access to that is the character that we see orchestrating the rebellion.
Mhm.
So I think she's making a statement there with that. And I think that's very timely right now as education is like under attack in our country.
They kind of switch gears to talk about like Haymitch not knowing that he's upsetting Snow because of his connection to Lenore Dove, which is kind of funny.
I feel like she basically wrote, she says, I enjoyed having Lucy Gray's memory rise up and disrupt his life. Like she was here for the crash out. She loves disrupting this man.
But Lenore Dove romanticizes the Cubbies' pre-war days, but she also, I think it's interesting, they said, and in particular, Lenore Dove is haunted by the fate of Lucy Gray. She wears bright bits of Lucy Gray's dress about her person and keeps her forbidden lyrics alive in private performances for Hamish and Burdock. The capital has never meant anything but oppression and pain for her people, and that fuels her desire to bring it down.
Mm.
So we're seeing more of Lenore Dove's motivation and confirming that she was wearing Lucy Gray's items, which was very exciting. But yeah, I think it's interesting the forbidden lyrics. And then they talk about song and the relationship to music and how books can be burned, but songs can be sung and remembered. So, like the Goose in the Common, that's like a little bit later on, but they talk about the Goose in the Common and how music like that can historically be ways to start a rebellion.
And then we talk about Plutarch, but she has a whole long section answering about Plutarch. David saying that he's playing the long game and showing that the events of the trilogy don't happen because the right girl shows up at the right time, which I feel like is a huge of this book, is showing that it wasn't just coincidence. There's been so much work that Plutarch and other characters have put in to the rebellion in order to make it work with the right Mockingjay whenever they came along.
I think that's important because he talks a little bit like Hamish talks, or Plutarch talks about this continuum and raising the question of, is it important if you're in a generation where you're not going to see the change? Like if I make that change, try to make a change now, but I don't live to see that change, is it worth it? And I think that's a good question. This ultimately just reminds me of what Gabby has talked about with, which we need to have Gabby on another episode, but Gabby talking about how it, like you said, it's not coincidence. Everything that everyone is doing is very, very, very intentional. And they're sacrificing parts of their lives, if not their whole life, for something that they may not even see in this lifetime. Plutarch is a very important character. And I also thought it was important that David mentions, like, he says, I know he is ambiguous for a reason. What does that mean? Does that mean another book? Does that mean another book where she's writing about Plutarch where there's answers because he is so ambiguous? I feel like that if there is to be another book, it would be a Plutarch book because going back to reread the 10th anniversary interview, she talks a lot about Plutarch. Rereading this one, she talks a lot about Plutarch. They talked about like how ambiguous he is for a reason. So that's just me sprinkling into this episode that there's going to be a third book in this trilogy, the second trilogy.
I think he's ambiguous because Suzanne is ambiguous.
Yeah, I know. I know, but I'm just saying. He is our morally gray character. That's the thing. And that's what I love about his character is that he is morally gray.
What I thought was really interesting was that Suzanne brings up that quote that Plutarch says at the end of Mockingjay, though we're fickle, stupid beings with poor memories and a great gift for self-destruction, maybe this will be it, Katniss, the time it sticks. Maybe we're witnessing the evolution of the human race. And I feel like I've never known exactly how to pin down that line. Like, is he being a little sarcastic? Does he actually believe that? But Suzanne says at his heart, he's an optimist. He doesn't accept that war and self-destruction are inevitable. So I feel like she adds some clarity to that line that Plutarch really kind of can get behind that and thinks, like, yeah, really, possibly, maybe this is the time that it sticks, and he hopes that it's the time that it sticks.
I never really thought of him as an optimist, so I thought that was
Yeah,
interesting.
but it makes me think that Suzanne is a bit of an optimist or considers herself to be a bit optimistic, which despite all of these books that she's written that are so painful at times, that she sees herself as an optimist and that the world can be better than this. I love that we get the confirmation that Clerk Carmine is the fiddler in Mockingjay, which I think, we all pretty well assumed, but it's nice to get. She's dropping a few confirmations in this interview, which is nice. But just to have that to paper, that yes, that is Clerk Carmine in Mockingjay. I do also like that there's kind of a theory that maybe Snow didn't like his classmates and kind of killed off that generation and poisoned them, but she does say that a handful of Snow's classmates might still be around by the trilogy, but they're not named characters, so
I'm
they're
interested
alive.
to see which few classmates he saved or allowed to live.
I really think that he didn't poison really any of them, to be honest. I think he has a weird care for them, like in a way, you know?
He wants he wants someone to remember where he started and what he became. Like he is just
Right?
so
Like he needs
selfish.
those classmates to be there to be like, look what I did. Like,
Hmm.
look at me now.
Yeah, exactly. That's just the type of person he is. We talked about the similarity between Katniss, Coriolanus, and Haymitch's family structures.
Hmm.
But they do have different experiences. I thought it was interesting that they talked about the protagonist in a lot of like YA books are usually like orphaned or have like
Hmm.
parental issues.
Yeah, Suzanne is like, David, you know this. This is a plot device. Like, what
This is Disney. Like we kill the
what is
mom
this
off.
question? But then we talk about
Hmm.
David asks about the sibling relationships and the concept of found siblings. And I love that we got a whole question about this and see the importance of this trope for Suzanne. She mentions Maisley and Haymitch, Finnick and Katniss, and Sejanus and Corio. I think it's interesting that she says all of them ultimately find siblings among people they once viewed as antagonists. And I love Finnick and Katniss. I feel like back in our Finnick episode, maybe it was Katniss or the Finnick, maybe I said it in both, but we had a section where we talked about our favorite relationship outside of like their romantic love interest. And I would always say Finnick and Katniss. When we were doing the reread, I always bring up Finnick and Katniss moments. They go on such a parallel journey together and support each other so much in Mockingjay. So I just love that she highlighted that relationship specifically. I love them. And I feel like she really highlights it in Sunrise. By the time we get to the end of the book and we get the epilogue, and Haymitch talks about Katniss and Peeta and like not wanting to let them in, and how Lenore Dove like tells him that they are his family and he
Hmm.
considers them family. And yeah, I never really considered found family as, if I were to list a list of tropes in the Hunger Games, that wouldn't be there, but now it would be. I
Yeah.
love that.
Transition to the newcomers. Ugh,
Amber, yeah.
Amber. Oh, stop
Which
it.
she talks about kind of Ambert's thoughts and vision, but I feel like he gets that from Beetee. And I know Beetee gets some flack in Mockingjay. Probably should get a little bit more flack than he does, to be honest. The bomb and everything. But I feel like one thing that's really commendable with Beetee is that we know that he started fighting really early. And even though he had so much to lose and ended up actually losing so much, that he was fighting anyway. And I feel like having so much to lose is what like stops us a lot of the time, which is like understandable, and keeps us in that implicit submission. But he fought anyway. And I don't know, I want to highlight that.
Yeah, I love that. And we know, like in the story, he loses his wife and his unborn child and Ampert. Like the sacrifices, he knew what he was sacrificing, and that's the thing. Haymitch doesn't really know what he's sacrificing in this position, but Beatty knows and he still does it, and he doesn't even know if it's something that he's going to see in this lifetime.
Mhm.
So, shout out to Beatty. Shout out,
Ugh.
I guess. And then we talk a little, or David talks a little bit about Mags and Wyrus's mentoring skills. And I also love how he asks, like, who would you want to be your mentor in the game?
Hey, Mitch.
Hey, Mitch. She's
Duh.
like, hey, Mitch, if he's not
Sober.
drunk. Yeah. But then I think it's also interesting she says Megs, who's brought home several victors while retaining her humanity. Now I
Mhm.
want to know more about Megs and all these victors she's brought back.
Yeah. David asks if little things like Sweetheart or the geese were planned things, or if she kind of made those connections work in creating Sunrise. And I love that she says these were things I knew about, but I didn't know if I'd ever write Haymitch's story. But Haymitch's decision to tend geese at the end of Mockingjay wasn't random. So these things, like she's probably had the idea of Luella in the back of her mind and the geese coming from his girl this whole time and just finally got to share it with us.
And I think reading that question and that answer is really exciting because there's a world where we didn't get this book, you know? Like she could have easily have not have given us Haymitch's story, but we got Haymitch's story, and it just makes me wonder what else she knows and what else is in store, if anything. Yeah, I mean, she's just a mastermind. That's really what every one of these interviews proves to us, is that she is just a mastermind. So,
Mm-hmm.
and we end on one
Agreed.
we end on
Agreed.
one final amazing question. I love this. David asks, and of course, for my final question, I need to ask, what do you have against gumdrops? And Suzanne says, not a thing.
Which, I
Love
don't
that.
know if that's true because she also includes gumdrops with Sejanus in Ballad. Like, what is it about gumdrops? I feel like I'm still lacking answers here.
I feel like you're the only person who has picked up on the Sejanus gumdrop thing.
Literally,
Like,
no one else talks about it. Like, he's
it's
holding the
important.
gumdrops in the playground. Like, am I crazy? That happened, right?
It happened, but for what reason?
But for what though?
What do you like? What is your favorite thing that you took away from this interview?
I like knowing that she always wanted to tell Haymitch's story. Like that
Mhm.
there was always excitement there, but that she may never have written it because she wanted to wait until there was something that she wanted to say in connection with it. And it just really reinforces the idea that she writes when she has something to say. And I love that about her writing in the Hunger Games series.
I also really value these interviews because she speaks so little on the books
Yeah.
that everything in these interviews is like gold. Every sentence is like very important to read. Every answer is very well thought out. So I'm looking forward to hopefully another, maybe like a 20 year
I know.
or
The
getting
20
old.
20 year would be great. We'll be back again for another Suzanne interview, please.
Well, so that we have now officially talked about everything in Sunrise. We talked about the book, we talked about the interview. So now we got to talk about the movie. So casting stuff is coming out. Emily and I are anxiously awaiting with the fandom for next announcements on casting, and the movie is going to start filming in July, so we're getting there. We'll see you next time for episode 92, which is crazy. So,
See ya.
bye.